The heavy cream-colored envelope sat on the scratched surface of the kitchen island, looking entirely out of place next to the stack of unpaid utility bills and the half-empty carton of cheap milk. It was an invitation to the Vanguard Charity Gala, the most exclusive high society event in Chicago. The calligraphy embossed in pure gold leaf caught the dim light of the overhead bulb glittering like a taunt. Serena stood in front of the ironing board, the hiss of the steam iron, the only sound in the suffocating silence of the apartment. Her fingers, once accustomed to the touch of Steinway piano keys and the cool surface of priceless diamonds, were now wrapped tightly around the plastic handle of the iron. She wore a faded grey t-shirt, the collar slightly frayed, and a pair of worn-out jeans. A small faint grease stain from cooking Julian's dinner the night before lingered on the fabric near her ribcage. She stared at the stain, her breath shallow. For 5 years, she had been Serena Vance, the quiet, supportive, and entirely unremarkable wife of Julian Caldwell, a mid-level director at a fast-rising tech and logistics firm. She had scrubbed floors, balanced tight grocery budgets, and smiled patiently while his condescending mother criticized her lack of ambition. She had made herself completely invisible so that Julian could shine. She had buried her true identity, Serena Elizabeth Sterling, the sole female heir to the Sterling global empire, because she wanted to be loved for the quietness of her soul, not the deafening roar of her bank accounts. The sound of the front door unlocking broke her concentration. The iron paused on the collar of Julian's crisp white dress shirt. Julian walked into the kitchen, his leather shoes clicking sharply against the cheap linoleum floor. He was a handsome man, sharp-jawed and ambitious, but lately there was a coldness in his eyes whenever he looked at her. It was the look of a man who felt he was outgrowing his current life, and unfortunately that included his wife. He didn't greet her, he didn't even look at her face. He walked straight to the mirror hanging in the hallway, adjusting his silk tie. "Is the shirt ready?" he asked, his voice clipped and impatient. "Almost," Serena said softly. She unplugged the iron and carefully draped the warm shirt over a hanger, walking it over to him. As she handed it to him, the scent hit her. It wasn't his usual cedarwood cologne. It was something sweet, overpowering, and aggressively floral. Chanel No. 5. It was the same perfume worn by Vanessa Trent, his 25-year-old marketing assistant. Serena's heart performed a slow, painful contraction in her chest, but she kept her face perfectly still. "The gala is tonight," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You said we would leave by 7. Julian let out a long, heavy sigh, the kind of sigh a teacher gives a slow student. He buttoned his shirt, staring at his own reflection rather than his wife. "Serena, we've talked about this. The Vanguard Gala isn't a neighborhood barbecue. It's a room full of CEOs, venture capitalists, and the elite of this city. My promotion is riding on the connections I make tonight." "I know," Serena said, taking a step closer. "I laid out my dress, the grey silk one. I've mended the hem." "The grey one," Julian interrupted, finally turning to look at her. His eyes raked over her faded t-shirt, the messy bun on top of her head, the exhaustion etched into the corners of her eyes. The look of profound distaste washed over his features. "Serena, that dress is 4 years old. It looks like a funeral shroud. You simply don't fit in that world. You're domestic, you're safe, you're simple." The word simple hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. It felt like a slap across the face. "I am your wife," she said, the slight tremor in her voice, the only betrayal of the storm brewing inside her. "When you receive your nomination tonight, I should be standing beside you." Julian scoffed, reaching for his Rolex watch she had bought him after saving her meager tutoring income for 2 years. "I'm meeting Vanessa there," he said casually, as if he weren't driving a knife into her spine. "She knows how to work a room. She understands the social dynamics. She's bringing a +1 pass, so I don't need you to tag along and look out of place. It's better for both of us. Try not to wait up." He grabbed his suit jacket and walked out of the apartment. He didn't kiss her goodbye. He didn't look back. The door clicked shut, leaving Serena standing entirely alone in the dim kitchen. Domestic, simple, out of place. The words echoed in her mind. Slowly, the trembling in her fingers stopped. The warmth in her chest, the desperate, hoping warmth that had kept her tied to Julian for 5 agonizing years, suddenly turned to ice, and she didn't cry. The time for tears had passed months ago, back when she first saw Vanessa's name flashing on his phone at 2 a.m. Serena walked out of the kitchen and down the narrow hallway to the guest bedroom closet. She pushed aside the vacuum cleaner and the winter coats until she reached the back wall. Her fingers, now entirely steady, found the hidden panel in the drywall. She pressed it, revealing a small biometric steel safe. She pressed her thumb to the scanner. The machine beeped a sharp clinkle sound and the heavy door clicked open. Inside, there was no money. There was only a thick black dossier, a velvet jewelry box, and a heavy encrypted satellite phone. It was a phone she had promised herself she would never use, a phone that connected directly to a world she had walked away from to prove she could be loved as a normal woman. She had her answer now. Serena picked up the heavy black phone. She pressed the single power button. The screen illuminated the dark closet with a cold blue light. She pressed the number whist and held it. The line rang exactly once. Sterling Security Private Channel. Identify. A crisp, disciplined British voice answered. It was Arthur, the head of the family's global security detail. Serena closed her eyes. When she opened them, the timid, accommodating housewife was dead. The eyes that stared into the darkness of the closet were the violet, predatory eyes of the Sterling bloodline. Arthur, she said. Her voice dropped an octave devoid of any warmth, resonant with ancient absolute authority. It is Serena. There was a profound, stunned silence on the other end of the line. A sharp intake of breath. Miss Serena, good God! It's been 5 years. Is everything all right? We haven't heard a word. I need a favor, Arthur. Miss Serena interrupted, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. But the family's not to be notified yet. Especially not my brother. Do you understand? Understood, miss. Whatever you require. I need access to the private vault at the Manhattan Depository, and I need you to arrange a courier flight to Chicago immediately. Bring the dress. The dress, Miss Arthur's voice wavered slightly. The black Dior. The one Madame Vivian wore to the Sovereign Summit. Yes, Serena said softly. The black one. Shall I dispatch a tactical team to your location? No, Serena said, looking back down the hallway, toward the kitchen where her cheap grey dress lay discarded on the bed. I will handle the transportation tonight. I just need to remember who I am, Arthur, before I burn his world to the ground. The courier arrived exactly 72 minutes later. He didn't knock. He simply stood in the dimly lit hallway of the apartment building, a ghost in a bespoke suit, holding a matte black garment bag, bearing the discreet embossed crest of the Sterling family. Serena opened the door, took the bag without a word, and closed the door on the life she was about to leave behind. In the small, cramped bathroom, with its flickering fluorescent light, the transformation began. And when she unzipped the garment bag, the scent of cedar and pure, untouchable wealth filled the stale air. The dress was a masterpiece of vintage Dior crafted from black silk that seemed to absorb the light around it. It was the dress her mother, Vivian Sterling, had worn to destroy a rival banking syndicate in Geneva 20 years ago. It held history. It held power. Serena let the frayed grey t-shirt fall to the floor. She stepped into the silk. The fabric slid against her skin like cold water, molding to her frame with terrifying precision. The neckline was sharp, elegant, plunging just enough to suggest danger, while the long sleeves and trailing hem projected absolute dominance. She pulled her hair into a severe, immaculate chignon, exposing the long, graceful column of her neck. She applied a single slash of deep crimson lipstick. No jewelry. The Sterling women never needed diamonds to prove their worth. Their bloodline was the only currency that mattered. She looked at herself in the cracked mirror over the sink. The submissive, exhausted wife was gone. The woman staring back had eyes like shattered amethyst, cold, ancient, and utterly devoid of mercy. The Vanguard Charity Gala was held at the historic Palmer House, a fortress of gilded architecture in the heart of downtown Chicago. The December wind howled off Lake Michigan, biting through coats and freezing the breath of the onlookers gathered behind the steel barricades. A fleet of black luxury vehicles, Bentleys, Maybachs, and stretched Phantoms crawled along the circular driveway, discharging the city's elite onto the sprawling red carpet. Paparazzi clustered like hungry wolves, their camera flashes detonating in rapid, blinding bursts. Serena arrived not in a limousine, but in the back of a battered yellow city cab. When the cab pulled up to the curb, a few of the photographers lowered their lenses, scoffing at the cheap intrusion among the fleet of million-dollar cars. But then the door opened, a stiletto heel sharp as a stiletto blade stepped onto the pavement. Serena emerged into the freezing night. She did not shiver. She did not clutch her arms for warmth. She simply stood straight, her posture so unnervingly perfect that a sudden strange hush fell over the immediate section of the crowd. The black silk of her dress rippled in the wind, wrapping around her like a storm cloud. For a brief second, the paparazzi hesitated, their instincts short-circuiting. They didn't know who she was, but the camera shutters began to fire anyway, a frantic mechanical roar trying to capture the sheer, devastating elegance of the unknown woman in black. Serena ignored them completely. She walked with a slow, measured cadence toward the grand entrance, her gaze fixed entirely on the heavy mahogany doors. At the top of the velvet-roped stairs stood the security checkpoint. A massive, broad-shouldered bouncer with a coiled earpiece and an iPad stood behind a brass podium. He was currently nodding subserviently to a tech billionaire, and his trophy wife letting them pass with a sycophantic smile. When Serena stepped up to the podium, the bouncer's smile vanished. He looked her up and down. His trained eye registered the lack of flashy jewelry, the absence of an entourage, and the fact that she had just stepped out of a cab. He didn't recognize the vintage Dior. To him, she was just an anomaly. "Neymar," he grunted, his voice dropping to a dismissive bass, his thumb hovering lazily over the screen of his iPad. "Serena Caldwell," she said. Her voice was calm, perfectly modulated, cutting through the ambient noise of the wind and the crowd. The bouncer scrolled down the list. He frowned, scrolling back up. He didn't even bother to look at her when he spoke. "Not on the list?" "Step aside, ma'am. You're blocking the VIP lane. Check under Julian Caldwell." Serena instructed, her tone not rising in volume, yet carrying a sudden heavy weight that made the bouncer involuntarily blink. "I am his wife. I am his +1. The bouncer let out a short, patronizing laugh. He tapped the screen with a thick finger. "Look, lady, I don't know what kind of stunt you're trying to pull, but I have Julian Caldwell right here on the Vanguard VIP tier, and his registered +1 is listed as Vanessa Trent, explicitly marked and confirmed. Now back away from the rope before I have you escorted off the premises." The words hung in the freezing air. Vanessa Trent. He hadn't just told her to stay home. He had actively, deliberately erased her name from the registry and replaced it with his mistress. He had traded his wife for a 25-year-old girl and a cheap floral perfume. The humiliation was designed to be absolute. Serena looked at the bouncer. She didn't argue. She didn't plead. She simply held his gaze, her violet eyes narrowing infinitesimally. The temperature around the podium seemed to drop another 10 degrees. The bouncer shifted uncomfortably, suddenly feeling an irrational urge to apologize, though he didn't know why. "Is there a problem here, Davis?" A deep, gravelly voice broke the tension. Serena and the bouncer both turned. Stepping out of a pristine silver Rolls-Royce was Marcus Thorne, the legendary silver-haired CEO of Thorne Global, the massive conglomerate that hovered over Julian's firm like a predator over a mouse. Marcus was 60 years old, ruthless, and commanded the kind of respect that made stock markets fluctuate with a single tweet. The bouncer immediately snapped to attention, his posture rigid with deference. "Mr. Thorne, sir. Good evening. No problem at all. Just turning away an uninvited guest. Her name isn't on the registry." Marcus walked slowly up the steps, adjusting his cashmere overcoat. He barely glanced at the bouncer. His sharp, hawk-like eyes were fixed entirely on Serena. He stopped 2 feet away from her. He studied the flawless architecture of her face, the terrifying calm in her posture, and the vintage Dior that he recognized immediately, having seen it decades ago on a woman who had once ruined his fiercest rival in a single afternoon. He looked into her eyes, the violet hue, the sterling gaze. Marcus Thorne's breath hitched slightly in his throat. He was a man who knew every major player on the globe, and while he couldn't immediately place her exact identity, his survivor's instinct screamed at him that the woman standing in front of him possessed more power in her little finger than everyone inside the hotel combined. "Uninvited," Marcus murmured, his voice laced with dangerous amusement. He turned to the sweating bouncer. "Davis, your incompetence is staggering. This woman is not uninvited." "But Mr. Thorne, the list." "Burn the list." Marcus snapped, his voice cracking like a whip. "She is with me. She's my personal guest for the evening. If you have an issue with that, I can have the hotel management replace you within the next 3 minutes. Do we understand each other?" The bouncer turned pale. He swallowed hard, baring his head frantically. "Yes, Mr. Thorne. I apologize profoundly, sir. Please, right this way, ma'am. He unhooked the velvet rope with trembling hands. Marcus Thorne offered his arm to Serena. Shall we, madam? It is far too cold to be dealing with the help. Serena looked at the offered arm, then up at the older billionaire. A faint, razor-thin smile touched the corner of her lips. She did not take his arm. She simply inclined her head in a gesture of aristocratic acknowledgement. Thank you, Mr. Thorne, Serena said softly. I appreciate the courtesy. Without waiting for him, she stepped past the velvet rope and walked through the grand, golden revolving doors. Marcus followed a step behind, a sudden chilling realization washing over him. He hadn't just escorted a beautiful woman into a party. He had just opened the gates for a hurricane. The Vanguard Gala was about to be torn apart. The grand ballroom of the Palmer House was a cathedral of modern capitalism. Vaulted ceilings adorned with restored Renaissance frescoes arched over a sea of the city's most powerful figures. 3 massive tiered crystal chandeliers hung from the heavens, raining a brilliant fractured light over the attendees. The air was thick with the scent of expensive Tom Ford colognes, roasted truffles, and the sharp, effervescent tang of vintage Dom Perignon. A string quartet played a low classical arrangement in the corner, though the music was entirely drowned out by the aggressive hum of networking and the clinking of baccarat crystal. When Serena stepped through the gilded archway into the ballroom, she did not pause at the threshold like a nervous interloper. She glided forward a shadow, cutting through a room built of blinding gold. As she moved across the imported Turkish carpet, an involuntary phenomenon occurred. The crowd, engrossed in their conversations of mergers and acquisitions, instinctively parted for her. Conversations faltered mid-sentence. Heads turned. They did not recognize her face. The sterling airs were famously kept out of the media glare, but the elite of Chicago recognized absolute terrifying authority when it walked into a room. The black Dior silk flowed around her legs like liquid obsidian. She kept her chin parallel to the floor, her violet eyes scanning the room with the detached precision of a predator locating its mark. It didn't take long to find him. Julian Caldwell was standing near a towering ice sculpture in the center of the room holding court. He had a crystal tumbler of amber scotch in one hand, gesturing expansively with the other. He was wearing his charm like a tailored suit, laughing too loudly at a joke made by the firm's vice president. And clinging to his left arm, anchoring herself to his rising star, was Vanessa Trent. Vanessa wore a dress of screaming sunset red. It was a designer knockoff cut too low in the front and too high on the thigh, entirely inappropriate for a black-tie corporate charity event. She looked flashy, desperate, and glaringly cheap. Yet Julian beamed at her, his hand resting possessively on the bare skin of her lower back. He looked at Vanessa with the exact expression of ravenous ambition that he used when looking at a favorable quarterly report. Serena felt a phantom ache in her chest, a final dying pulse of the woman who had spent 5 years washing this man's clothes and celebrating his minor victories in their tiny kitchen. She let the ache wither and die, freezing it over with the sterling ice. She walked directly toward the circle. The vice president of the firm was the first to notice her approach. His smile faltered, his eyes widening slightly as he took in the imposing figure in the black dress. He nudged Julian. Julian turned around, an arrogant smirk already preloaded on his face. When his eyes locked onto Serena, the smirk shattered. The blood drained from his face so rapidly, he looked as though he were about to faint. The tumbler of scotch shook in his hand. Serena! He choked out, his voice cracking entirely, devoid of its usual smooth baritone. The circle of executives and their wives went utterly silent, stepping back slightly to create a makeshift arena. Vanessa turned, her heavily contoured face twisting into a sneer of disbelief. She looked Serena up and down, completely failing to recognize the vintage haute couture, seeing only the woman she had categorized as a pathetic domestic obstacle. Oh my god! Vanessa laughed, a harsh, grating sound that cut through the refined hum of the ballroom. Julian, is this her? Is this the anchor you were telling me about? Julian's shock rapidly morphed into a defensive, visceral rage. He stepped forward, putting his body between Vanessa and Serena, a gesture of protection that he had never once offered his wife. What the hell are you doing here? Julian hissed, his voice low and vicious. He grabbed Serena's arm, his fingers digging painfully into her bicep. I explicitly told you to stay home. You are not on the list. Serena looked down at the hand gripping her arm, then slowly up to Julian's eyes. She did not wince. "Remove your hand from my person, Julian," she said softly. Julian flinched, instinctively releasing his grip. There was something terrifying in her tone, a coldness he had never heard in the 5 years they had been married. But his embarrassment fueled his arrogance. He looked around at his colleagues who were watching the scene with thinly veiled amusement and judgment. He felt his hard-earned reputation crumbling. "You need to leave," Julian demanded, his voice rising, drawing more attention from the surrounding tables. "Look at yourself, Serena. You look like a widow. You wore a funeral dress to the biggest night of my career. You are embarrassing me in front of the board." Vanessa stepped out from behind Julian, emboldened by his cruelty. She swirled her champagne, taking a step closer to Serena. "Honestly, honey, did you dye your wedding dress black? Or did you find that in a thrift store? This is the Vanguard Gala, not a PT. A bake sale. You don't belong here. Look around. You look like the hired help." A few of the younger executives' wives covered their mouths, stifling giggles. The humiliation was thick, heavy, and intensely public. Serena stood in the dead center of it, the target of a dozen judging eyes. She stood in silence while they celebrated her replacement, listening to the man she had lifted from obscurity call her an embarrassment. "I belong wherever I choose to stand," Serena said, her voice a calm, devastating drawl. "I came to support my husband." "I am not your husband tonight." Julian snapped, the remaining shreds of his composure vanishing. He was desperate to prove to his superiors that he was not tied down by this drab, embarrassing woman. He pointed a shaking finger at the exit. "I am done pretending, Serena. I am done being held back by a woman who has zero ambition, zero class, and zero understanding of what it takes to survive in this world. I need a partner who fits my future." He pulled Vanessa closer to his side. "Vanessa is my future." The ballroom grew unnervingly quiet. Even the string quartet seemed to lower their volume. Julian took a deep breath, delivering the final fatal blow. "Go back to that depressing apartment. Pack your cheap clothes and get out. We are getting a divorce. I'll have my lawyers send the papers in the morning. Now get out of my sight before I call security and have you dragged out." The word echoed. Divorce. Vanessa smirked, a triumphant, venomous curl of her lips. She had won. She had publicly deposed the wife and claimed the crown. Serena stood perfectly still, and the silence stretched tight as a piano wire. She looked at Julian Caldwell, really looked at him. A man wearing a suit, bought with her secret funds, wearing a watch she had purchased, standing on a career foundation she had quietly engineered. She felt the final thread of her old life snap. Serena reached into the small black silk clutch she carried. She did not pull out a tissue to cry. She did not pull out her keys to leave. She pulled out the heavy black satellite phone. "Julian?" Serena said, her voice echoing in the sudden breathless quiet of the room. A terrifying predatory smile finally bloomed on her lips. "You want a divorce? Consider it granted. But you are vastly mistaken about who holds the power to drag someone out of a room." Julian stared at the heavy, encrypted satellite phone in Serena's hand. For a split second, a flicker of genuine confusion crossed his face. He knew every item in their cramped apartment. He knew the limits of her meager bank account. He had never seen that piece of technology in his life, but his confusion was quickly swallowed by his towering arrogance. He let out a sharp, derisive bark of laughter. "What is that Serena A-prop? Are you calling a cab company? Because if you need bus fare, I can have Vanessa give you a 20. Vanessa giggled, sipping her champagne with exaggerated elegance. "Maybe she's calling her imaginary lawyers Julian. Let her play pretend before security throws her out." Serena did not look at Vanessa. She kept her violet eyes locked squarely on the man who had just discarded her like garbage in front of the city's elite. Her thumb pressed the speed dial. The phone emitted a sharp, high-frequency, electronic chirp that sounded entirely foreign in the velvet-draped luxury of the ballroom. It was the sound of a military-grade satellite uplink securing a closed network. The line connected instantly. "Arthur," Serena said, her voice dropping, but all pretense resonating with a terrifying absolute authority that made the vice president standing behind Julian take an involuntary step backward. "Standing by, Miss Serena." The crisp, disciplined voice of the sterling head of security echoed faintly through the earpiece. "I am in the grand ballroom of the Palmer House." Serena commanded her words, falling like blocks of ice on marble. Initiate protocol Sterling 1. Secure the perimeter. Take the floor. No one leaves this room. Copy that. Protocol Sterling 1 authorized. Breach in 5 seconds. Serena lowered the phone. She did not hang up. She simply let her arm drop to her side, her posture straightening, her spine aligning like a steel rod. Julian's sneer faltered. Protocol! What, Serena? What is wrong with you? Have you lost your mind? He didn't get to finish his sentence. Exactly 5 seconds after Serena lowered the phone, the world shifted. First, the music died. The string quartet in the corner abruptly stopped playing, not because the song ended, but because the audio cables powering their amplifiers were remotely severed. Then the ambient, romantic amber lighting of the ballroom flickered wildly. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd as the chandeliers went completely dark for 2 agonizing seconds. When the lights slammed back on, they were no longer the soft, flattering hues of a high society gala. The hotel's emergency halogen floodlights had been overridden and activated. The room was suddenly bathed in a blinding, clinical, unforgiving white light. It was the lighting of an interrogation room. It was the lighting of a battlefield. What the hell is going on? Julian demanded, looking up at the ceiling, his voice trembling slightly. Did the power blow? Before anyone could answer, the massive 12-foot oak doors at the main entrance of the ballroom doors that had been locked and guarded by Vanguard's private security exploded inward with a deafening crash. The heavy wood slammed against the walls, splintering the plaster. Through the threshold marched 20 men. They did not look like police officers. They did not look like standard hotel security. They moved with a terrifying synchronized lethality. They wore matte black tactical suits, Kevlar vests, and heavy combat boots that struck the marble floor in unison. They were a private military force, highly trained, heavily armed, and entirely devoid of hesitation. Emblazoned on the right breast of their tactical vests in dull silver thread was a crest, a platinum spear piercing a flawless diamond. The Sterling family crest. The sheer violence of their entry paralyzed the room. The elite of Chicago, billionaires, politicians, and socialites froze in terror. Champagne flutes slipped from manicured hands, shattering on the floor. Women screamed softly, clutching their pearls, while the men instinctively backed away, their bravado instantly evaporating in the face of superior, unapologetic force. The Palmer House security team, the burly men in suits who had been checking iPads just moments before, rushed forward to intercept the intruders. The lead tactical officer didn't even slow his pace. He simply raised a gloved hand, pointing a single finger at the hotel's head of security. Stand down, the officer barked, his voice amplified by a collar mic. This facility is now under the jurisdiction of Sterling Global Security. Any interference will be treated as a hostile threat. The hotel security took one look at the tactical gear, the sidearms strapped to the men's thighs, and the cold dead eyes of the mercenaries, and they immediately raised their hands, backing against the wall in complete submission. They were paid to bounce drunken guests, not to engage an army. In less than 30 seconds, the tactical team had fanned out. They secured every exit, blocking the doors with their bodies. 2 men flanked the stage. 4 men took the corners of the room. The perimeter was sealed. The grand ballroom was a cage, and the wealthiest people in the city were now hostages to a woman in a vintage dower dress. Marcus Thorne, the silver-haired CEO who had escorted Serena inside, stood near the bar. Unlike the panicked crowd around him, he was not trembling. He looked at the silver crest on the mercenaries' chests, then looked across the room at the woman he had brought in. A low, reverent chuckle escaped his lips. He slowly placed his champagne glass on the bar, crossed his arms, and prepared to watch the slaughter. In the center of the room, Julian Caldwell was hyperventilating. His face was the color of wet ash. He looked at the armed men guarding the doors, then slowly, agonizingly turned his head back to his wife. Serena had not moved a single inch. She stood amidst the chaos with devastating calm. Serena, Julian whispered, his voice cracking, the scotch sloshing wildly in his shaking hand. Serena, what did you do? Who are these people? Call the police! Somebody call the police! The police are not coming, Julian, Serena said. Her voice was not loud, but in the terrified silence of the ballroom, it carried like a gunshot. The communications grid for this block has been jammed. The local precinct has been instructed by the mayor's office to stand down. Vanessa Trent dropped her clutch. The cheap clasp broke, spilling lipstick and credit cards onto the carpet. She backed away from Serena, her eyes wide with mounting horror. You're You're crazy. You're a psycho, Julian. Do something. I'm doing something, Vanessa. Serena said, her violet eyes locking onto the trembling mistress. I am cleaning house. Serena slowly stepped forward. The vice president of Julian's firm, who had been laughing just minutes ago, scrambled out of her way as if she were made of fire. Julian stumbled backward, his shiny leather shoes catching on the edge of the Turkish rug. He nearly fell, catching himself on the ice sculpture. His hand burned against the frozen surface, but he was too terrified to move. You told me I didn't fit in your future, Julian. Serena said, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor as she closed the distance. You told me I didn't understand what it takes to survive in this world. She stopped at 3 feet away from him. The air around it felt charged with electricity. You are about to learn. Serena whispered, then the ice in her voice freezing the marrow in his bones, that the world you are trying to survive in belongs to me. Before Julian could fully process the gravity of Serena's words, a low, rhythmic thrumming began to vibrate through the reinforced floorboards of the Palmer house. It started as a subtle hum barely noticeable over the panicked breathing of the crowd, but within seconds it escalated into a deafening, percussive roar. The crystal drops on the darkened chandeliers clinked furiously against one another. The unmistakable heavy chop-chop-chop of military-grade rotor blades was tearing through the freezing Chicago night. The executives and socialites looked up at the vaulted ceiling in mounting alarm. Is that a helicopter? The vice president stammered, spilling the rest of his drink down his tuxedo shirt. They don't have clearance for a rooftop landing here. The airspace is restricted. We restrict the airspace, Serena said, her voice completely flat. A sharp melodic chime cut through the industrial noise. It came from the far wall of the ballroom, where a pair of innate gold-plated elevator doors were set into the marble. They were the private service elevators explicitly reserved for heads of state, and the absolute highest echelon of VIPs. The digital floor indicator above the doors was counting down rapidly from the roof. 10, 9, 8. Julian stared at the descending numbers, a cold, nauseating dread pooling in the pit of his stomach. His mind trained to analyze data and predict corporate trends was catastrophically failing him. He looked at the black tactical mercenaries guarding the exits. He looked at the vintage Dior silk clinging to the woman he had treated like a maid for 5 years. The puzzle pieces were floating in front of him, but his ego refused to let them snap into place. 3, 2, 1. The gold doors slid open with a smooth, silent hiss. 2 more men in tactical gear stepped out first, their hands resting casually on the grips of their holstered sidearms. They flanked the entrance, their eyes scanning the ballroom for threats. Then a man stepped out of the elevator. Dominic Sterling was 35 built, like a heavyweight fighter, but moving with the predatory silent grace of a panther. He wore a bespoke midnight blue Tom Ford suit that fit perfectly over his broad shoulders. His jawline was sharp enough to cut glass, but it was his eyes that paralyzed the room. They were the exact same shade of shattered amethyst as Serena's. He possessed an aura of such concentrated violent wealth that the air around him felt physically heavy. Behind Dominic walked a woman who instantly sucked the remaining oxygen out of the grand ballroom. Vivian Sterling, the matriarch of the Sterling Empire. She was 65, but her face was a masterpiece of severe ageless architecture. She wore a floor-length coat of silver mink over a stark black gown. In her right hand, she held an ebony walking cane topped with a flawless, impossibly large blue diamond. She did not walk. She glided a queen inspecting a conquered territory. Whispers erupted through the paralyzed crowd, spreading like a brush fire. Is that Dominic Sterling? Good God, that's Vivian, the Iron Queen. The Sterling Syndicate. What are they doing in Chicago? They operate out of London and Geneva. Marcus Thorne, the silver-haired billionaire who had escorted Serena inside, immediately bowed his head as the Sterling matriarch passed his position near the bar. Madam Vivian, he murmured with profound, unmistakable reverence. Vivian did not stop, but she offered a slight acknowledging tilt of her chin. Marcus, I see your stock recovered from that unfortunate dip in October. Try to keep your board under control. Yes, madam, Marcus replied, stepping back. Dominic and Vivian walked directly down the center of the ballroom. The crowd parted for them with violent speed people, practically tripping over themselves to clear the path. They ignored the tech moguls. They ignored the politicians. They walked straight toward the ice sculpture. Julian felt his knees weaken. The Sterling family was corporate royalty. They were the apex predators of global finance. A single nod from Dominic Sterling could make or break a Fortune 500 company. Julian had spent his entire career reading about them in the Wall Street Journal, idolizing their ruthless takeovers. He instinctively straightened his tie, his corporate survival programming kicking in. Maybe they were here for the Vanguard Gala. Maybe they were here to announce a partnership. But Dominic didn't look at Julian. He stopped 2 feet away from Serena. For a long, agonizing moment, the ruthless billionaire simply stared at the woman in the black dress. Then Dominic Sterling, a man who bowed to no government and no king, lowered his head in a deep, formal gesture of absolute respect. "Sister!" Dominic's voice boomed deep and resonant, echoing off the Renaissance frescoes above. "You called? The perimeter is ours." Julian stopped breathing. His lungs simply refused to expand. "Sister!" Vivian stepped forward, her silver mink coat brushing against the floor. She looked at Serena with eyes that had watched empires fall. She raised a gloved hand and gently, almost tenderly, touched Serena's cheek. "You wore the Dior," Vivian murmured, her voice like crushed velvet lined with razor blades. "Good. You finally look like my daughter again. I was growing incredibly tired of waiting for you to end this ridiculous charade." "The charade is over, Mother," Serena said, leaning slightly into the touch. "The experiment has concluded." Julian's brain short-circuited. He staggered backward, his shoulder slamming into the ice sculpture. It was impossible. It was a psychotic break. He looked at the modest, quiet woman who had painstakingly budgeted their weekly groceries. He remembered her clipping coupons at the kitchen table. He remembered telling her she was too simple to understand his world. "No!" Julian gasped, his voice thin and hysterical. A nervous, frantic laugh bubbled up from his throat. No. This is a prank. Serena, did you hire actors? Did you blow our savings on some insane theatrical stunt because you were jealous of Vanessa?" Vanessa, who was still clutching her ruined knockoff purse, looked at Julian as if he had lost his mind. Even she, through her sheer arrogance, could feel the authentic, terrifying gravity radiating from the two newcomers. Dominic slowly turned his head. He looked at Julian Caldwell. It was not a look of anger. It was the detached clinical look a scientist gives a particularly repulsive insect before dropping it into a jar of acid. "You must be Julian," Dominic said, his tone conversational but dripping with lethal intent. "I have read your portfolio. You are remarkably mediocre." Dominic turned his gaze to the breathless, terrified crowd, projecting his voice so that every single CEO investor and socialite in the room could hear him perfectly. "Ladies and gentlemen of Chicago," Dominic announced, "there seems to have been a catastrophic misunderstanding regarding the guest list tonight. A mistake made by a man whose ambition vastly outpaced his intelligence." Dominic stepped back, gesturing toward Serena with an open palm. "Allow me to formally introduce the majority shareholder of the Sterling Global Syndicate, the sole female heir to a $300 billion empire, and my sister, Serena Elizabeth Sterling." The name dropped into the silence like a nuclear warhead. Serena Elizabeth Sterling. A collective gasp sucked the remaining air from the room. The vice president of Julian's firm physically collapsed into a nearby chair, his face buried in his hands as he realized the magnitude of the mistake his company had made. Julian Caldwell fell to his knees. The marble floor cracked against his kneecaps, but he didn't feel the pain. He looked up at the woman standing above him. The grey faded t-shirt was gone forever. The quiet, submissive wife was dead. Standing in her place was a queen wrapped in black silk looking down at him from a height he could never ever reach. I gave you 5 years, Julian," Serena said softly, her violet eyes devoid of even a trace of mercy. "I stripped away my name, my money, and my power to give you a chance to prove you had a soul." She took one slow step closer, looking down at his trembling, pathetic form. "And you proved," she whispered, "that you are entirely hollow. Now I'm going to show you what happens when you try to replace a Sterling." The silence in the grand ballroom was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating vacuum, the kind of stillness that precedes a devastating earthquake. Julian Caldwell remained on his knees, his expensive suit trousers pressed against the freezing marble. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was waiting in agonizing slow motion for the ground to rush up and shatter him. Dominic Sterling did not offer Julian the mercy of looking at him any longer. He stepped over Julian's legs as if stepping over a discarded piece of trash, and walked with measured predatory steps toward the main stage. The master of ceremonies, a minor television personality hired to host the gala, was cowering behind the brass podium. He looked at the armed mercenaries, then at Dominic, his face pale and slick with sweat. Dominic simply held out his hand. The host scrambled backward, practically throwing the microphone into Dominic's palm before retreating to the shadows of the velvet curtains. Dominic tapped at the microphone. The sharp percussive sound echoed through the vaulted ceiling, making several executives in the front row flinch. "Ladies and gentlemen!" Dominic's voice filled the room, smooth, resonant, and dripping with corporate lethality. "I understand we're interrupting the Vanguard Executive of the Year proceedings. I apologize for the delay. We Wellingtons excuse me, Sterling's value efficiency above all else. Therefore, I will expedite the evening's agenda." Behind Dominic, the massive state-of-the-art LED screen that had been displaying the glowing Vanguard Gala logo suddenly flickered. The award tonight was sponsored by Vanguard Tech and Logistics, Dominic stated, pacing slowly across the stage. A firm that until this afternoon prided itself on aggressive market expansion and mid-tier supply chain management. Mr. Caldwell here was slated to receive the highest honor of the night for increasing profit margins by 22%. Julian's breath hitched. A sick, desperate glimmer of hope flickered in his chest. The numbers were real. He had built those margins. Even if Serena was a billionaire, he was a genius in his own right. He could survive this. He could start over. Dominic paused center stage. He looked down at his phone, tapping the screen once. However, Dominic continued, his voice dropping into a chilling register. At precisely 4:45 p.m. Eastern Standard Time today, a private equity firm known as Obsidian Holdings initiated a hostile leveraged buyout of Vanguard Tech and Logistics. The crowd gasped. Murmurs of shock rippled through the sea of CEOs. A hostile takeover of that magnitude usually took months of vicious boardroom warfare. Obsidian Holdings, Dominic smiled, a shark baring its teeth in the dark water, is a wholly owned subsidiary of the Sterling Global Syndicate. We purchased 51% of the controlling stock through a network of proxy shells. Your board of directors surrendered unconditionally 20 minutes ago. Julian felt his heart stop. It literally felt as though the organ seized in his chest. Dominic leaned over the edge of the stage, locking eyes with the broken man on the floor. I am now the sole owner of the company you work for, Julian. I own your desk. I own your contracts. I own the chair you sit in to pretend you are an important man. You can't, Julian wheezed, clutching his chest, his corporate bravado entirely shattered. That's illegal. The SEC was notified an hour ago, Dominic interrupted smoothly. And they were entirely fascinated by the secondary findings of our immediate internal audit. Dominic pressed a button on a small remote in his hand. The giant LED screen behind him flashed, transitioning from the Vanguard logo to a stark high-definition spreadsheet. It was accompanied by scanned copies of receipts, invoices, and bank transfer logs. The documents were magnified to 50 feet wide, impossible for anyone in the room to ignore. When one purchases a new vehicle, one checks under the hood for rot, Dominic explained to the captivated, horrified audience. Imagine my profound disgust when I found a parasite feeding on my new asset. A red laser pointer danced across the massive screen, highlighting specific rows of data. Company funds allocated to a luxury suite at the Four Seasons, booked for 3 consecutive weekends. Dominic read aloud. An unauthorized withdrawal of $45,000 from the corporate expansion budget funneled into a private account. The lease on a Porsche Cayenne. A diamond tennis bracelet from Cartier. Julian's face turned the color of old parchment. He scrambled to his feet, swaying dangerously. Those were client entertainment expenses. It's standard practice. We were wooing investors. Were you? Serena's voice cut through the air. She walked slowly toward the stage, her black Dior dress absorbing the harsh halogen light. She stopped beside Julian, her presence alone forcing him to shrink away. She didn't look at the screen. She looked at Vanessa. Who was the client? Julian. Serena asked, her tone conversational yet carrying the weight of an executioner's axe. On the screen, Dominic clicked the remote again. The redacted names on the invoices vanished, revealing the beneficiary, recipient Vanessa Trent. The entire ballroom inhaled sharply. The vice president, who had earlier laughed with Julian, now looked at him with absolute unadulterated disgust. This wasn't just an affair, it was gross corporate malfeasance. It was theft. Vanessa Trent let out a high-pitched shriek. She backed away, her hands flying to her face as the executives around her physically stepped away, treating her like a walking contagion. No! No! That's a lie! She screamed, her voice cracking hysterically. He told me it was his bonus. He told me he earned it. Vivian Sterling, standing near the ice sculpture, struck the marble floor once with the tip of her diamond-topped cane. The sharp crack instantly silenced the mistress. You wear a counterfeit dress reeking of cheap ambition, and you accept stolen corporate funds to fund your pathetic illusion of grandeur. Vivian said, her voice radiating absolute zero. You are not a victim, Miss Trent. You are a remarkably cheap liability. And in our world, liabilities are liquidated. Dominic stepped back to the microphone. Embezzlement, corporate fraud, aggravated tax evasion. It is a rather impressive felony trifecta, Julian. Please! Julian sobbed, the tears finally breaking, hot and pathetic, streaming down his perfectly shaved cheeks. Please, Dominic. Serena, please! I'll pay it back. I'll work for free. I'll fire her right now. Just don't destroy me. You destroyed yourself, Mr. Caldwell, Dominic said coldly. As of this precise second, your employment and the employment of Miss Trent is terminated. Furthermore, my legal team has already forwarded this entire unredacted dossier to the district attorney's office. Dominic checked his watch, a custom Patek Philippe that cost more than the Palmer house itself. The FBI and the Chicago Police Department are waiting at the service exit, Dominic announced. They have warrants for both of your arrests. Protocol Sterling 1 is lifted. Let the authorities in. The heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom, previously guarded by the tactical mercenaries, swung open. The flashing red and blue lights of half a dozen police cruisers immediately painted the walls of the grand foyer, casting long, chaotic shadows into the room. A squad of uniformed officers and 2 men in federal windbreakers marched into the gala. Julian Caldwell looked at the approaching police. He looked at the giant screen displaying his crimes to the entire elite society of the city. He looked at the woman in the red dress who was now screaming and crying, trying to run toward the kitchen doors before a mercenary effortlessly blocked her path. And finally he looked at Serena, his wife, the woman he had called simple, the woman he had discarded to build an empire entirely, unaware that she was the empire herself. The trap had sprung, the jaws had closed, and there was absolutely no way out. The rhythmic, heavy tread of police boots echoing across the marble floor of the Palmer house sounded like the beating of a funeral drum. 4 uniformed officers and 2 federal agents in dark windbreakers moved swiftly through the parted sea of Chicago's elite. The blinding, chaotic flashes of red and blue light from the cruisers outside bled through the grand foyer, painting the terrified faces of the Vanguard executives in alternating shades of panic. Julian Caldwell remained on the floor. His impeccably tailored Tom Ford suit, a suit paid for by the very funds he was now accused of stealing, was wrinkled and stained with the condensation from the ice sculpture he had collapsed against. He watched the federal agents approach their badges, glinting under the harsh halogen glare, and a primal, unadulterated terror seized his vocal cords. He scrambled on his hands and knees, ignoring the sharp pain radiating up his legs. He didn't crawl toward the authorities to surrender. He crawled toward the only person in the room who had the power to stop the impending annihilation. He crawled toward the woman he had just publicly discarded. Serena! Julian wailed, his voice cracking into a pathetic high-pitched sob that echoed humiliatingly through the vaulted ceiling. He lunged forward, desperately reaching out with trembling, sweaty hands to grab the hem of her black Dior gown. Before his fingers could even graze the silk, a massive Kevlar-clad combat boot stepped firmly into his wrist. Julian screamed a pathetic sound of pain and shock. The lead tactical mercenary of the Sterling security detail stood over him, applying just enough pressure to grind Julian's bones against the marble without breaking them. "Do not touch her!" The mercenary commanded, his voice a low, mechanical growl devoid of human empathy. Serena did not flinch at Julian's scream. She looked down at him, her violet eyes devoid of the warmth, the forgiveness, and the quiet patience that had defined her existence for the past 5 years. She looked at him as one might look at a stain on the pavement. "Serena, baby, please!" Julian sobbed, tears and snot mixing on his face, entirely destroying his carefully curated corporate image. The man who had sneered at her faded t-shirt 20 minutes ago was now weeping at her feet like a beaten dog. Please tell them to stop. Tell Dominic this is a mistake. I'm your husband. We have a life together. Remember our apartment. Remember the dinners you cooked. We love each other. Love her. Serena repeated the word slowly, as if rolling a foreign, distasteful object on her tongue. She signaled the mercenary with a microscopic nod. The guard lifted his boot, allowing Julian to pull his bruised hand back to his chest, whimpering. You did not love me, Julian. Serena said, her voice a devastatingly calm melody that cut through the ambient noise of the police radios. You loved the utility I provided. You loved that I made myself small so you could feel massive. You loved the comfort of a loyal servant waiting for you while you chased the illusion of power. I was stressed, Julian pleaded, his chest heaving, frantically, trying to weave a narrative of victimization. The promotion, the board, the pressure. Vanessa meant nothing. She was just a distraction. You are my wife. I was just angry earlier. I didn't mean any of it. Across the room, Vanessa Trent, who was currently being violently handcuffed by a female police officer, heard his words. Her self-preservation instinct overrode her terror. He's lying! Vanessa shrieked, her voice shrill and hysterical as the metal cuffs clicked shut around her wrists. He told me he hated you. He told me you were a lazy parasite. He forced me to sign those invoices. I didn't know it was stolen money. I swear to God he manipulated me. Shut up, you stupid bitch! Julian screamed back at her, his mask of sophistication entirely obliterated. Vivian Sterling, standing beside her son, let out a soft, elegant sigh of supreme boredom. Like rats trapped in a flooding sewer, she observed quietly. Fascinating how quickly they cannibalize each other. Serena took one step closer to Julian. The room held its collective breath. The federal agents paused instinctively, allowing the billionaire heiress the final word before they made the arrest. You told me before this entire room that you needed a partner who fit your future. Serena quoted, her tone chillingly conversational. She tilted her head slightly, the diamonds in her mother's tiara catching the light. You are facing federal indictments for wire fraud, embezzlement, and tax evasion. The minimum sentence is 15 years in a maximum security penitentiary. I assure you that, Julian, I would not fit in there. Julian's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The sheer mathematical finality of his ruin finally crushed the remaining breath from his lungs. Serena slowly reached for her left hand. With deliberate, agonizing precision, she slid the simple, inexpensive gold band off her ring finger. It was the ring Julian had bought her 5 years ago, a ring she had cherished more than the multi-million-dollar Wellington diamonds sitting in her family's vault. She held the ring between her thumb and forefinger, suspending it over Julian's head. You leave this marriage with precisely what you brought into it? Serena whispered. Nothing. She opened her fingers. The gold band fell. It struck the hard marble floor with a sharp, piercing clink. The sound bounced off the walls, a final definitive period at the end of their history. The ring rolled in a tight circle, before coming to a dead stop mere inches from Julian's trembling face. You can use that for your commissary fund, Serena said. She turned it back on him. Julian Caldwell, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud and corporate embezzlement. The federal agent announced, stepping forward and hauling Julian up by his armpits. You have the right to remain silent. Julian did not fight them. His legs dragged behind him like dead weight as the officers forcefully marched him toward the exit. The Miranda rights faded into a blur of background noise. As the police dragged him through the grand foyer, the massive oak doors opened to the freezing Chicago night. The paparazzi, having caught wind of the police presence at the Vanguard Gala, had multiplied tenfold. As Julian Caldwell was thrust out into the biting wind in handcuffs, a blinding explosion of camera flashes erupted. The man who had desperately wanted to be seen by the world was now on the front page of every major news outlet, branded as a criminal and a fraud. Inside the warmth of the ballroom, Serena stood flanked by her brother and mother. The vice president of the firm, trembling uncontrollably, suddenly began to clap. It was a slow, nervous applause. Then Marcus Thorne joined in. Within seconds, the entire ballroom erupted into a standing ovation. Not a celebration of the drama, but an absolute terrifying submission to the raw power the Sterling family had just displayed. Serena did not smile. She stood tall, an untouchable queen in a dress of black silk, breathing in the scent of complete absolute victory. But the destruction of Julian Caldwell was not yet complete. He had lost his future. But in the back of the police cruiser, he was about to lose his past. The interior of the Chicago Police Department cruiser smelled of stale coffee cheap disinfectant and the metallic tang of adrenaline. Julian Caldwell sat violently shivering on the hard, molded plastic of the back seat, his hands shackled painfully behind his back. His wrists were already chafing against the cold steel. He pressed his forehead against the reinforced plexiglass window, his breath fogging the pain as he watched the world he had desperately tried to conquer slip away into the freezing night. Outside, the paparazzi were a screaming, writhing mob against the police barricades. Their camera flashes detonated in rapid succession, illuminating Julian's ruined, tear-streaked face in stark, unforgiving bursts of white light. He closed his eyes, his mind desperately trying to categorize the catastrophic events of the last hour as a nightmare. "I am Julian Caldwell," he told himself frantically, his chest heaving. "I am the executive of the year. I built those profit margins. I am a self-made man. I can hire a crisis management firm. I can fight this." The cruiser lurched forward, but immediately ground to a halt as the crowd of reporters surged against the hood of the car, blocking the exit from the Palmer House driveway. The federal agent driving the vehicle blasted the siren, a deafening wail that vibrated in Julian's teeth, but the mob was relentless. Through the fogged glass, Julian saw a figure standing just behind the outermost police barricade. It was an older man, his shoulders slightly stooped against the biting wind. He wore a faded heavy canvas work coat and a worn-out flat cap. His hands, calloused and stained with years of motor oil, rested deep in his pockets. He wasn't holding a camera. He wasn't screaming questions. He was simply staring directly into the back of the squad car. "Dad," Julian whispered the word, tearing at his raw throat. It was Thomas Caldwell, a retired mechanic who had spent his entire life working invisible blue-collar jobs to keep a roof over Julian's head. Julian had always been deeply, secretly ashamed of him. He had explicitly forbidden his father from attending the Vanguard Gala, claiming the tickets were too exclusive, afraid that Thomas's rough edges would tarnish his own polished elite image. Julian hammered his shoulder frantically against the glass. "Dad, over here!" Thomas saw him. The older man spoke briefly to the uniformed officer manning the barricade. The officer recognized the look of a shattered parent and nodded, lifting the yellow tape to let Thomas through. He walked slowly, his gait uneven from years of heavy lifting, until he reached the side of the cruiser. The federal agent in the passenger seat rolled the window down just 2 inches. The freezing wind immediately whipped into the car, carrying the chaotic noise of the street. "Make it quick, Pops," the agent grunted over his shoulder. 2 minutes before we clear the mob." Julian lunged forward as far as the seatbelt allowed, pressing his face to the narrow gap. "Dad, thank God!" Julian babbled, his words spilling out in a panicked, breathless rush. "Dad, listen to me! You have to call Friedman and Associates first thing in the morning. Mortgage your house if you have to pay their retainer. Serena went insane. She hired these corporate thugs. She hacked the hotel screens. She's got everyone believing she's some billionaire heir. She framed me for the accounting error's dad." Thomas Caldwell did not reach out to touch the glass. He did not offer words of comfort. He stood in the freezing wind, looking at his son, with a pair of eyes that held no anger, no panic, and absolutely no pity. They held only a profound, crushing disappointment. "She didn't frame you, Julian," Thomas said. His voice was gravelly quiet, yet it easily pierced the noise of the sirens. Julian froze. "What, Dad, you don't understand. She didn't frame you?" Thomas repeated, the heavy finality in his tone making Julian's stomach drop. "And she certainly didn't lie about who she is." Thomas pulled one of his bare-weathered hands from his pocket. He wiped a stray flake of snow from his cheek. "I knew exactly who she was the day you brought her to my house 5 years ago." The world outside the cruiser seemed to tilt violently on its axis. The flashing lights blurred. Julian stared at the old mechanic, his brain refusing to process the data. You knew she was a Sterling." Thomas let out a dry, humorless chuckle that sounded like grinding gears. "I didn't just know her, Jules. Before I opened that little auto shop in the suburbs, before your mother died, I was the fleet manager for the Sterling Global Syndicate at their New York estate for 20 years. I polished the Maybachs you drool over in magazines. I maintained the helicopter that just landed on the roof of this hotel. I used to drive Miss Serena to her private kindergarten. Julian stopped breathing. The air in the squad car suddenly felt thinner than the atmosphere on Mars. When you met her at that coffee shop downtown, it wasn't a coincidence. Thomas continued, leaning slightly closer to the gap in the window. She was there to visit me at the garage. She wanted to check on the old driver she remembered from her childhood. She saw you there. She thought you were charming. She thought you were ambitious. So, you set me up, Julian accused, a desperate defensive anger flaring in his chest. You and her? You played a game with my life. I warned her. Thomas suddenly snapped, his voice rising, carrying a flash of raw parental grief. I told her, Miss Serena, my boy, is smart, but he has a hole inside him that only money can fill. He thinks a man's worth is printed on his bank statement. But she wouldn't listen. She said she saw goodness in you. She wanted to try the normal life experiment. She wanted to know if you could love Serena the person, not Serena the checkbook. Thomas shook his head, a gesture of absolute defeat. I made a deal with her. I promised on my life not to tell you who she really was. I wanted to give you a chance to prove me wrong, Julian. I wanted you to be the honorable man she thought you were. I wanted to be proud of you. Tears streamed hot and fast down Julian's cheeks. Dad, please. If I had just known the truth, I would have treated her like a queen. I would have been different. That, Thomas said, his voice dropping to a devastating whisper, is exactly why you failed her test. Julian sobbed, thrashing helplessly against his cuffs. I still built my career. I'm still a VP. I earned my way to the top. Thomas looked at him, and with a few quiet sentences, entirely dismantled the last remaining pillar of Julian Caldwell's ego. Do you really think you earned any of it, Julian? Thomas asked softly. Do you know how you got into Wharton Business School? My mechanic's salary didn't cover that tuition. The Sterling Foundation issued an anonymous grant. Do you know how you landed your first internship at Vanguard? Serena made a single phone call from our kitchen. And 3 years ago, when you botched the Tokyo logistics account and cost the firm millions, you weren't saved by a clerical error. Serena quietly transferred the funds from her private trust to cover your losses so you wouldn't be fired. Julian felt as though he were falling down a black, bottomless elevator shaft. Every achievement, every trophy, every moment of arrogant pride in his life had been a meticulously constructed illusion. He wasn't a shark. He wasn't a prodigy. He was a charity project. He was a plant kept alive by the secret watering of the woman he had just thrown away for a counterfeit mistress. You didn't build anything, Thomas said, stepping back from the car. You were heavily subsidized by the woman you humiliated. The federal agent hit the gas as the barricades finally cleared. The cruiser began to pull away. Dad! Julian screamed, slamming his head against the glass. Dad, don't leave me, please. Thomas Caldwell did not follow the car. He stood on the freezing pavement and watched it go. Suddenly, a fleet of heavily armored matte black SUVs with the Sterling crest glided smoothly out of the Palmer House driveway, cutting flawlessly through the chaos. As the lead vehicle passed the tinted window, rolled down just an inch, Thomas recognized the violet eyes looking out at the night. Thomas took off his worn flat cap, holding it over his heart, and bowed his head in deep, solemn respect to the true architect of the empire. Inside the police cruiser, Julian Caldwell collapsed against the hard, plastic seat, weeping in the total suffocating darkness of his own absolute worthlessness. 3 days later, the conference room at Sullivan and Cromwell, one of the most ruthless law firms in Manhattan, smelled of lemon polish and absolute defeat. Julian Caldwell sat on one side of the massive mahogany table wearing a brightly colored state-issued orange jumpsuit. He had been denied bail. Sitting at the far end of the table, looking incredibly haggard with her dark roots showing, was Vanessa Trent. On the other side sat Serena, dressed in a flawless bone-white power suit, flanked by 3 lawyers who looked like they ate glass for breakfast. Julian's court-appointed attorney nervously cleared his throat, asking for a reduced settlement. He audaciously suggested alimony, citing Julian's accustomed lifestyle. Serena silenced the lawyer with a single raise of her hand. She slid a thin blue folder across the table, I have calculated the exact cost of your existence over the last 5 years, Julian, Serena stated coldly. The mortgage payments I secretly made. The luxury car lease is funded by my trust. The clothes on your back. The total is $4.2 million. My settlement offer is this. I will forgive this debt, and in return you leave this marriage with zero assets. You are a liability, and I am zeroing out my balance sheet. Julian, entirely broken, signed the decree with a violently shaking hand. Serena then turned her violet eyes to Vanessa. She slid a plane ticket and a contract across the table. My family owns a lithium extraction facility in Dead Horse, Alaska. It is perpetually sub-zero. They are in desperate need of a night shift sorting manager. It pays minimum wage, but includes a heated cot. Vanessa gasped, tears welling in her eyes. I can't go to Alaska. I don't even own a winter coat. We will provide a parka. Serena smiled a terrifying razor-thin expression. You can take the job, or my legal team will sue you into oblivion for conspiracy to commit fraud. You will spend the next 20 years in depositions. Choose. 6 weeks later, the wind in Dead Horse, Alaska howled like a dying animal. Vanessa Trent stood on the sorting line, her body buried in a filthy, oversized orange parka. Her manicured hands were now cracked and bleeding. As she sat in the dreary metal cafeteria, eating grey stew, she looked up at the wall-mounted television. An entertainment channel was broadcasting live from Paris. The wedding of the century, the banner read. On the screen, Serena Sterling stepped out of a white Rolls-Royce outside the Louvre. She wore a custom gown woven from silk, and thousands of micro-diamonds looking like a literal goddess of power. Beside her stood Alexander Thorne, the shipping magnate she was meant to marry. Vanessa stared at the screen, dropped her plastic spoon, and wept into frozen, bleeding hands. 3,000 miles away in the Otisville Federal Penitentiary, inmate 89402 sat on the edge of his steel bunk. Julian Caldwell pulled his scratchy wool blanket up to his chest. As he did, he noticed the small white manufacturing tag stitched into the hem. Property of Sterling Correctional Services. Julian stopped breathing. He looked at the soap by the sink. He looked at the plastic cup. They all bore the Sterling crest. She hadn't just put him in prison. She had purchased the prison. He was literally locked inside her cage. A guard walked by and slid a small foil-wrapped package through the meal slot. New owner mandated an improved nutrition program, the guard grunted. Julian opened the foil with trembling fingers. Inside was a single chocolate chip cookie, dusted lightly with sea salt. It was the exact recipe Serena used to bake for him on Sunday afternoons. The Sundays he had ignored her. He took a bite. The sweet, salty taste of the home he had destroyed exploded in his mouth. Julian collapsed to the cold concrete floor, curling into a ball, as guttural, suffocating sobs ripped from his throat. He finally understood the true depth of her revenge. She didn't just take his future. She made sure his present was a permanent, agonizing reminder of the absolute perfection he had thrown away. Far across the ocean, standing on a balcony overlooking the glittering lights of Paris, Serena Sterling sipped her champagne. She did not look back at the dark city, nor did she think of the man in the cell or the woman in the snow. They were ghosts now. She had reclaimed her empire, proving once and for all that dignity is quiet while insecurity is loud. The woman they broke had returned untouchable, and her reign had only just begun. Which moment do you think changed her the most? Do you believe more in emotional justice or forgiveness? And do you think a too late apology is ever enough? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you love this comeback story, make sure to subscribe for more.